one. And all right, starting recording. And all right. Hello everyone, this is Mr. Brass, and with me here is Kelsey Hazzard of Secular Pro Life.
Hello.
How are you doing, my
I'm
good
doing
man?
great. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's so great to have you on. I remember we had actually planned this earlier, but what happened with me was that my family and I had a power outage that ended up taking us, off. Like we had to actually go to a hotel for a day, and so I came back home and I was just exhausted from all that, like the everything. And I actually had set my alarm clock for like 8:30, and I missed it, and I didn't wake up until like 10 minutes ago.
These
Yeah,
things happen. I'm not gonna worry about it.
yeah.
But
But
we can
anyway,
keep
I'm
it
so
short when
glad
we
that
get stressed.
yeah, I'm so glad that I could still have you on though. So anyway, since we last talked, we actually this was before Roe v. Wade actually happened.
You mean
Um,
knobs?
yeah, and now Dobbs happened, and woman, yeah, before Dobbs happened, I mean, and so now Dobbs has happened. How has that been like for you?
It's definitely been interesting. It's more of a beginning to the fight or a new phase of the fight. It's you can't savor the victory for very long. You got to keep moving because there's just so, I mean, the reaction from the abortion industry and its allies was just to flood the internet with misinformation. And so we're here, as a small outfit trying, it's like whack-a-mole trying to debunk all of these myths about, supposedly we're making it illegal to treat ectopic pregnancies one day, and then the next day the Guardian's putting out some article with fake pictures of that just looks like stringy nothing in a petri dish and calling that a 9-week embryo. Like there's
Yeah,
so, it's just one thing after another. And on the one hand, it's in a weird way encouraging because it's nice to know they have to rely on lies. So it gives me more confidence that I'm on the right side of the issue. But
hmm,
it's very frustrating, very annoying that there's really nothing too low. So we just have to keep hitting on it and hitting on it, especially on Twitter, Facebook. We're on TikTok now. Trying to reach people with the facts because we do have a whole lot of media bias to contend with, and the best way to counteract that is reaching people directly.
absolutely. And I remember the last time we'd actually got on, like we had gone more on when it came to like how secular pro life came together. And actually, I talked about how I was influenced by secular pro life myself, where I'd actually went from being a pro abortion advocate into, becoming pro life because partly because of secular pro life.
And we always love to hear stories like yours. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, in my own funny case, like I actually had gone over this in a previous interview when I became, when I stopped being a Christian, my family was a bit disappointed. They weren't entirely shocked because we've never been like a real religious family. So they were a bit, disappointed, you could say. But once I became pro life, they were like flabbergasted.
Hmm.
Like they were
We
much
have that
more
on tape
shocked.
sometimes.
Yeah. So yeah, and it was just funny because, and it's especially because of me, because I've been so pro-abortion most of my life that was such a big thing for me, and so that sort of is what contributed to my family just feeling shocked by me.
Well, and it takes a lot of courage to change, to have such a 180 on such a contentious topic. It does shock people, but but it's a good thing, of course, to to stand out and to to try to do more than just swim with the crowd and be part of a tribe or political binary. Being pro-life is one of those things that ought to bring the nation together. That can't we all at least agree on not killing babies? So the more that people step out of their closets to say, yes, I'm pro-life, especially people who wouldn't be expected to be pro-life, the more shocking it is, the better.
Yeah, like women, for example, aren't really expected to be pro-life.
Well, I mean, yeah, that's the media narrative, but realistically, polling for many decades has shown little to no gender difference in opinions on abortion. That's purely a media narrative. But being an atheist and being pro-life statistically actually is on the numbers more unusual versus being a woman being pro-life.
Yeah. Well, what people fail to even realize about that is when you actually look up the gender differences between an atheist, it's like, I think something like, I don't know, I think like most atheists tend to be men.
Yeah, the atheist community does skew male and also skews white. So certainly we have a ways to go on that front as well. But that might be
always
outside the
funny
topic of the podcast.
to think that much more diverse community
I
because it's
would love to
only
see
one
more
thing.
diverse atheist community and more diverse pro-life community. I think both movements would benefit greatly from it.
Yeah. Oh, I'm just more saying I would always expect that would be a more diverse community, given how it's really only one thing, and people could just all go under it. But when I compare the diversity between, let's say, Christianity in America, it's like you're much more likely to find more minorities as a percentage within Christianity than you really are like in the atheist community in America.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, and the pro-life movement is also more diverse than the atheist community, and in broad terms, I would say.
Yeah.
But the pro-life atheist community or the pro-life secular community is just really fun. I mean, I have gotten to meet people through this volunteer work who I never would have met otherwise. And if you broaden the scope even more, getting to know people from religious minority groups who are pro-life, Wiccans and Mormons and Muslims and so on, who gravitate towards secular pro-life because we're very welcoming and we're not Pat Robertson or whatever, So that I've always said that secular pro-life, having a leadership position can be a little bit like herding cats, but it's also very rewarding.
Yeah, I definitely can see that as well. And so I remember like the Dobbs decision was actually a pretty unique case because it was like spoiled, like I think maybe a couple weeks or months, like a month in beforehand.
Yeah, that was definitely unprecedented, to have a Supreme Court leak, which was very clearly intended to try to intimidate one or more justices into changing their vote, and that's a disconcerting reality for our constitutional system, separation of powers. Thankfully, all of the justices and the majority stood their ground, but yeah,
Well,
it was that was that I don't know if that ever hadn't happened before, to have a decision leak in advance, and I think that really was just a preview of how far pro-aborts are willing to go.
Yeah, and I remembered like with I think also with them it was sort of like, well, trying to pressure Supreme Court justices is a lot more difficult than say trying to intimidate, like, let's say the president, because presidents are elected and they have term limits. So it's a lot easier to actually intimidate them than people that are, they're appointed and they serve for life.
Right. Well, and that's a feature, not a bug. that's the purpose of giving Supreme Court justices a lifetime appointment, is to try to insulate them from public pressure.
Mhm. Yeah, and I always think that it's also sort of a just a good thing in general that I remember. So they've been talking about trying to expand the Supreme Court.
They did, but then it really fizzled out. Like I haven't heard any expand the Supreme Court talk in months. There was some commission put together to study it, and then its report was a total nothing burger. I just don't see that going anywhere.
Yeah, well, that and it's like they never seem to think about how this stuff could backfire them in the future, because what would be stopping, let's say, a pro-life Republican or even maybe a pro-life Democrat in the future, um, like they become president and let's say they have to have a string of new nominees and they could just do it again.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's absolutely right. It would just create this cascading thing where you expand the Supreme Court once, and it's going to be expanded with every president, or every time the party in power changes is going to just be expanded that many, and it becomes a doom spiral where until your Supreme Court needs doesn't have enough chairs where you have to move the building. I mean, it's silly. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I've always said if I became president, one of my Supreme Court nominations would be like a 20-year-old.
There is a constitutional. Is there? Well, let's see. For president, it's 35.
Yeah.
I'm not actually, off the top of my head, I'm not sure if there is an age requirement for.
There actually isn't.
Huh. That is interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Although I think
if I get a 20-year-old to do it, then if there's a 20-year-old that becomes a Supreme Court nomination, my pick, that ensures they're going to be in there for at least 60 years.
Right. Then the issue becomes how does somebody get a law degree by the age of 20? It's like Doogie Hazzard Court edition.
It would probably have to be like a what do they call it? Like one of those savants.
Yeah. Yep.
I know like the youngest age to ever graduate from college is like, I think like 7 or 8.
Wow.
Yeah. That was a savant.
Yeah. I was relatively young in my law school class because I did college in 3 years. I distinctly remember going to a pre-class get-togethers, like during the summer before we were going to start. And I had not yet had my 21st birthday. I was like 20 and almost like 10 months or something like that. And they had this little, get to know your classmates event where alcohol was served. And I had to wear a wristband so that I wouldn't be served alcohol. And I felt like I had a neon sign on my head, like, this is a young person. I was so embarrassed. I can't imagine how much more embarrassed I would be to be nominated to the Supreme Court.
Although, yeah, and what I always did sort of think about is how, when it comes to the nomination for president, like, you having to be 35 years old in order to run, I'm like, well, yeah, in the context of that, like, you have to sort of remember that the life expectancy back then was not nearly as high as it is today.
Mm-hmm.
So
right. That would suggest that we ought to raise the age.
Yeah. And on one hand, I do know that part of that is influenced by like infant mortality rates.
Mm-hmm.
If someone was able to live past the age of 5, I think there was a good chance they could live. Yeah. Although
I'd like to see a maximum age, mainly just because I don't want another Trump v. Biden rematch. And I don't think anyone does, and yet we're barreling toward it. I just don't understand how, in a nation of 300 plus million people, those are the best two choices we can get.
It's just like it seems to always be older people, like even older than the 35. I mean, you would realistically think you would at least have like maybe 36-year-old that would be doing it.
Yeah, well, we just have a system where it takes so many years in politics to get the connections and the fundraising and so on that you would need to even consider a run. I think it has more to do with that than age on its own. It's just the time that's needed to have the name recognition.
And I actually pointed out to people that, like, because a lot of times when I talk about presidencies and I'm talking about like how men are represented in politics, people will point out to me, well, 100% of presidents have been men,
Mm-hmm.
and well, I point out this fact: 61% of all presidents have been lawyers, and I'm like, it seems much more odd that we would have like considering that men are 50% of the population. It seems more statistically viable that we would naturally have an all male like presidencies than it would be that we would have 61% that come from one particular field, which is lawyering. Considering that
lawyering and politics have always been pretty tightly entwined, and obviously for a good part of our nation's history, female presidents were not a legal option. I do think that we'll probably see a female president in my lifetime. I just really want it to be, for my own feminist reasons, I really want it to be somebody who makes it on her own and is not like the spouse of a politician or the daughter of a politician or in any way relying on any kind of cronyism. It needs to be somebody who comes into politics completely independently, because I think that was part of the problem with Hillary Clinton.
Or they get in because the male president that they got into was so old that he died while in office, and she just happened to be his vice president.
I mean, if that's what happens with Harris, then I don't know. I have no idea. I have concerns about Harris for other reasons, because like she is a pro-abortion ideologue. I mean, she would like to see pro-life people in prison. Biden, I think, is just being a politician and doesn't have a spine about anything, and his party wants him to be pro-abortion, so that's what he's going to be. I don't think he has any real convictions one way or the other. Kamala Harris is a believer in abortion. I would be scared to live in that scenario.
And what's a bit funny about Kamala Harris and stuff like that is like, well, I mean, even with Joe Biden more so with Joe Biden, is that he's like 180 on pretty much every position he's had for his entire
even something as moderate as the Hyde Amendment, he had, like I said, he has no spine.
Yeah, and I actually remember that he was actually one of the Democrats that supported overturning Roe v. Wade, like I think maybe in the 80s or 90s when that was brought up. Yeah. He was actually one back then that he was on board with that. And not to mention that he'd also been he had been anti-gay marriage his entire political career up until right when America started changing their opinion on that.
Well, to be fair, that describes most of the Democratic Party.
Yeah. Oh, I agree that it was the right move, but it just seems sort of odd that, well, I mean, it's not odd, but it does say something that he only began to change his mind right when he said, oh, I'm not going to be able to get elected or any political power if I don't change my mind on this.
Yeah, like he's not principled. Yeah. And Harris is principled in the wrong direction.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, a funny thing to point out is that also Joe Biden's the only second Catholic president. And And another funny thing is that the Republican Party has never actually had a Catholic president on their side.
Yeah.
There's only been two. One was JFK, and the other one's been Joe Biden.
Right.
And so the Republican Party has never even had a Catholic president.
Yeah. Have we had a Catholic nominee?
I think we have. I remember actually the first Catholic to ever run for president was in like 1935.
Okay.
And that person, his Catholicism was actually why he lost.
Oh, I'm sure it was. Yeah, in 1935, absolutely. Yeah.
Like people found out that he was Catholic, and his political, I don't know who he was running against, but he actually, that was like the big thing that they went after him. They said if he wins, then he'll just be a stooge of the Pope, and they completely buried him, and that's how he lost it. Mm. And it wasn't really until John F. Kennedy actually won that when anti-Catholic sentiment in America started going down more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, or at least being less socially acceptable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which today, that sort of surprised people because it just seems like, oh, America's always been more pro-Catholic. And I'm like, nah.
No.
It really hasn't.
No. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, and I only know that because I went to law school and I studied, a lot of these anti-Catholic laws as part of my religious liberty education, like these various attempts to, shut down parochial schools and things of that nature because Catholicism was associated with immigrants and they didn't like immigrants. So there's definitely a sordid history there.
Yeah. Which, I mean, that's another thing. If you want to talk about a disparity, is I think Catholicism makes up 25% of the American population, mm-hmm. and we've only had two presidents that were actually Catholic, now mm-hmm. are identified as Catholic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the other thing too. Is and as an atheist, I'm not. Who am I to say who's Catholic and who's not? But I'm pretty sure they're supposed to be anti-abortion if they're Catholic. And it's funny, our executive director, Monica Snyder, is our main voice on Twitter running the Secular Pro-Life handle. And she has a little beef with the Catholics for Choice account because she subtweeted them and said, hey, we have something in common. Neither one of us is Catholic. It blew up. It was great.
Oh, yeah. I love Monica Snyder.
She is an absolute delight. We are coming up on her second anniversary as our executive director, which is pretty incredible. The time has flown. It was less than 2 years ago that we were an all-volunteer organization, and finally we got the funding that we needed to have her as our first full-time person, and boy, has she been busy. It couldn't have passed a more critical time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and she's also been doing a bunch of podcast interviews.
Yep.
I think she's done a lot of work for the Equal Rights Institution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, she's been all over the place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I always think it's sort of interesting, how even in the Secular Pro Life organization, there's actually a lot of diversity politically as well.
Yeah, so that, and thanks for bringing it up, because we always like to talk about the leadership is 3 atheist women, a liberal, a moderate, and a conservative. I'm the moderate, Monica is the conservative, and Teresa Bukovac is our flaming liberal hippie, who we all love.
Yeah.
She also is the head of Progressive Anti-Abortion Uprising. They're doing some fantastic work too.
Yeah, and well, I've actually heard this a lot more lately than ever before. Although I did hear it before, the Dawes position, and I remember. Well, I mean, don't you know, Monica, that the only reason why you've ever ever got into law school and everything is because of abortion.
What? Monica didn't go to law school. I did.
Oh, and not Monica, you. For some reason, I get you and Monica confused.
It's fine. Uh, yeah, I mean, yes. So that's the other thing too, is that we have the diversity of politics and also the diversity of our backgrounds, because um, my background is a legal background. Teresa's the activist on the street background, and Monica's background is in biology. She's our STEM person. She's my go-to for any kind of peer-reviewed research, all the prenatal development stuff. And actually, before we hired her, she had gotten her master's and she was working in a forensics lab. So she did a complete career change coming into the nonprofit sector.
Mhm. Well, I mean, well, let me just rephrase. I said, well, don't you know, Kelsey, that the only reason why you've been able to get into law school and everything is because abortion has been an option?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, that's such bullshit. That makes me so angry. No, I didn't kill any kids to get my law degree. That's incredibly insulting and anti-feminist. Also, knew plenty of people who got married and had kids and were in law school. But myself, I just, I avoided any unplanned pregnancies and went about my education. So no, do not attribute my success to the availability of abortion. That is gross. Secular Pro-Life was one of quite a few organizations that signed on to an amicus brief in the Dobbs case that was all about this, what we call the reliance interest. This idea that women are relying on abortion to make it in a man's world. In addition to being just, insulting, it's also factually wrong, because the abortion rate had its peak in the 90s and then plummeted. And as the abortion rate was plummeting, women's participation in the workforce was going up. Right? So correlation doesn't give you causation. And you don't even have correlation. So how can you possibly say that abortion is causing women's success in the workforce? It's absolutely ridiculous.
Hmm. Yeah, and I've always said that that's probably one of the most legitimate sort of misogynistic statements you could probably get, is to say that if women don't get abortion or they don't have abortion available, then they'll just never succeed.
It is misogynistic. I agree, and defeatist and untrue.
Mhm. Yeah. So I've always just found that sort of. I mean, I remember that even in my own life, is that I mean, I know plenty of women that have gone to school and they've been mothers. So I've never really bought that line.
Yeah. So I don't know if your audience necessarily knows this about me, but I actually am now a foster mother of 4 while practicing law. So it can be done. Having a family and having a career, yeah, work-life balance is a struggle for everybody, but that doesn't justify killing kids.
So yeah, well, I mean, being a foster parent like yourself, I imagine that you have an advantage because whenever they say, about, oh, well, have you adopted any kids? And you like, yeah, 4.
It makes no difference at all. I mean, when they ask, oh, what are you doing for kids in foster care? When my answer is I am a foster parent, they just don't care. They always come up with something, because it was never a good faith question, right? It was never like, oh, now that I know that you are a foster parent, and I'm going to be pro-life now. That was never they were always just, it was always just throwing crap on the wall to see what sticks. They're not sincere when they ask that type of question.
Well, and also I know a lot of, I believe even with Secular Pro Life, they do some charity work, or at least they point to more pregnancy resource centers that help women. that are going to
So secular pro-life doesn't do direct provision of services. We're an education group. We're mostly, like I said, online trying to combat misinformation and that sort of thing. That's our role. But there are a ton of pregnancy resource centers out there and wonderful direct services organizations out there. We're not trying to reinvent their wheels. So we're always pointing. So just to give an example, like during the pandemic, particularly the early days of the pandemic, where travel shut down, conferences shut down, those represented our main expenses. Conference fees and flights and that sort of stuff. So we realized, hey, this is an opportunity for us to kind of put the brakes on our own fundraising and tell people to go donate to XYZ because these pregnancy centers are going to need help during the pandemic. All right, so we promoted Abide Women's Health in particular out in Dallas. So that type of thing. We're also working pretty closely with a group called Support After Abortion. Monica's been involved in some of their podcasts, trying to make sure that post-abortion healing and resources are available to secular people, because that has been a significant issue where so many of these post-abortion groups are faith-based. And to be fair, I kind of get it. Like Christian doctrines of being forgiven and getting to reunite with your loved ones in the afterlife, like those would be appealing doctrines for someone who's mourning the loss of their aborted child. But if you don't believe that Christianity is true and you're not interested in converting to Christianity, that shouldn't be a barrier to your post-abortion healing and grieving the loss of your child. So that's another area where we're trying to be more involved.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, don't you know that secular pro-life is just a bunch of closeted Christians trying to portray themselves as atheists?
Right.
Agnostic?
Yeah. I don't believe in God, and I say so openly. So if I'm a Christian, I'm a pretty bad one. I'm a pretty blasphemous one. No, it's silly. That's just, they just don't have anything better to say. They don't have a better argument to make.
It's sort of like as a non-Christian myself, I get that sort of thing all the time. It's like, you're funded by the Catholic Church, and I'm like,
no.
One, I'd be more than open to taking the money, but
I think they need it for their legal funds for these cases. They can use them for that.
I'd be more than glad to take the money, but they've never offered me any.
No. The weird thing now is I've run into a couple of people who have some conspiracy theory that I'm funding a lot of activists, like me personally, am funding various like clinic rescue people, and it's like, what if I could? I'd love to. I'd love to support that person's salary. That's a great activist person. I don't have that kind of disposable income for, I give money to charity. I just don't fund entire salaries.
Yeah. I've told people like before, I'm a proud sellout. So, if the Catholic Church were to come and say to me, hey, we want you to be anti-abortion and we'll give you like $1 million to just speak Catholic stuff, I'd say, oh, I'll do that. I would totally, but sadly that check has never came in my mail.
Yeah, it's just silly. At a certain point, they're just so caught up in their own narrative that they can't see that, yes, there are pro-life atheists. Yes, there are pro-life women. Just deal with it. Just come up with an argument instead of an ad hominem.
Yeah, and well, like they'll also even ask, like, when did you realize that you were a self-hating woman with internalized misogyny?
Never.
So, I imagine it must be pretty lonely in the law school being pro-life, because I think most people in law tend to be more pro-abortion.
I think it depends on where you are. My law school had a pretty well-sustained Advocates for Life student organization that I was part of. So but I wasn't going to school in like the Northeast. I wasn't in a part of the country that's deep blue. Um, so it just depends. But I thought I had a really positive experience in law school. I would do it again.
Yeah. So I mean, what kind of what do you work on as a lawyer?
Funny enough, my day-to-day legal practice has nothing to do with abortion. My pro-life advocacy is completely volunteer on my free time. My regular day job, you know, it is nothing that anybody's going to do a TV show about. It's breaches of contract, it's business partnership disputes, it's construction defects, it's condo and HOA issues. I do get the occasional defamation defense case, which I really like.
Mhm.
But yeah, I'm just a civil litigation attorney. Not my. I mean, I think the law degree and the legal background certainly helps me in my pro-life advocacy. I'm able to look at the legislation that's being proposed or the cases that are in the pipeline and sort of translate that to secular pro-life's broader audience, which has been really useful.
Mhm. Yeah. So if you win your client money, does that mean it's called technically hazard pay?
Nicely done. All right. Well, on that note, I think I have to go. But
Uh,
that's a great note to end on. It's been a pleasure,
yeah.
Gary. Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Well, yeah, we should definitely do this another time when we have more time to work with. But it was so great talking to you.
All right. You have a great one, and
All
all of
right.
the listeners too.
All right. Well, this is Mr. Brass saying